Hello, welcome to Unit 8, Evolution, Day 1. And today's aim is how does natural selection lead to the evolution of a new species? So we just talked about in Unit 7, artificial selection, where humans are choosing what traits are going to be passed on to future generations. But now we're going to go over all of the features of natural selection as part of our evolution unit. And evolution, of course, means change over time. So evolution doesn't happen overnight or even in the lifetime of one individual species. Evolution happens over a long period of time, many generations. So over many generations, a species may evolve, and what traits actually get passed on over time? Well, nature decides that. So let's look at an example of evolution by natural selection in this image here below. So this first picture shows a bird and some mice. And the bird is flying through the sky and the mice are on some sand. And it says, a population of mice has moved into a new area where the rocks are very dark due to natural genetic variation. So there's a variety in the genes. Some mice are black while others are tan. And we can see the tan mice really easily sticking out on that dark background. And so can the bird. The tan mice are more visible to predatory birds than black mice. Thus, tan mice are eaten at a higher frequency than black mice. Only the surviving mice reach reproductive age and leave offspring. So nature is selecting the black mice as better suited to this environment. So because we have very dark rocks, the black mice are better suited to this environment because they're camouflaged. Let's not use environment twice. They're better suited to this situation, right? So this isn't, they are more fit. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're faster and stronger. It doesn't say anything about that. But in this case, they are more fit because their fitness means their ability to survive and reproduce in this environment. Right? So the tan mice might have been faster, they might have been stronger, they might have been smarter, but this bird ate up all the tan mice. So they're not actually living to a reproductive age and having offspring. So then now some mice reproduce, giving the next generation. And what's the next generation going to look like? We can see we started with about more tan mice. We started with 5 tan mice, and now this next generation, there's only 2 tan mice because the black mice had a higher chance of leaving their offspring than tan mice. The next generation contains a higher fraction of black mice because the black mice had greater biological fitness. So what is evolution by natural selection? Go ahead and write your own definition. Pause this video and write your own definition, but it is change over time in a population of organisms based upon their biological fitness. Where in certain adaptations, in this case, having gray fur or black fur was an adaptation. But if they lived in an environment where the sand was a lighter color, then that wouldn't be the case, right? But in this environment, black fur was an adaptation. And we're going to read a little bit more about adaptations, biological fitness, and evolution here below. So we're applying Darwin's ideas, and Darwin, as we probably already know, is the scientist who defined natural selection. And we're going to be talking about another scientist who was very influential to the development of evolution, but we really only study him today to talk about how he was wrong. But Darwin, he was right. So, the theory of evolution, which is change over time, by natural selection can be defined as follows. Okay, so there's 5 tenets of natural selection. Let's go through them. 1, every population produces more offspring than can survive in an environment with limited resources. So more offspring than can survive, okay? So overpopulation, known as overpopulation, right? So that means some are gonna die because the organisms produce more than can survive. But this is very important to how populations will change over time, how they will evolve. All populations show variation in traits. So 1 is overpopulation, 2 is variation in traits, and variation is heritable, right? Variation is based on our genes. 3rd, in a given environment, individuals with traits that make them better suited to survive long enough to reproduce leave more offspring, right? So if you can survive, you can have more babies. That makes sense. That's what biological fitness means. And number 4, over time, inherited traits that improve the chances of survival, called adaptations, become more common than other traits. In other words, the population evolves by having a greater proportion of these traits that make them more likely to survive and reproduce. This is why natural selection is commonly referred to as survival of the fittest. So survival of those that make it to reproductive age. All right, so what does the word overpopulation refer to in the 3rd line? Go ahead and pause this video and answer these questions based on the passage above. All right, so we can see here overpopulation refers to producing more offspring than can survive. And this is a tenet. This is required for natural selection to happen. In an environment. right? So if we have a very large population, that means there's going to be a larger variety of traits. And if some of them die, the organisms that died off had less desirable traits. That is at least the theory of evolution, right? But remember, this is a scientific theory. So this is stronger than you might say, I have a theory about that. This is a theory that has been supported by scientific evidence for many generations. But we will talk a little bit about the history of science during this unit. So how we actually came up with this theory of evolution. So define adaptation, we can see here in the passage, adaptations are inherited traits that improve an organism's chances of survival. So many adaptations started as a mutation, but then they were a mutation that made the organism more fit, better suited to its environment. So, how does natural selection lead to the evolution of a population? So, over time, right, and evolution is change over time. Over time, traits that increase an organism's chance to survive and reproduce. So that's evolution doesn't necessarily make a better animal, a better organism, a better human. Evolution makes an organism that can survive and reproduce. So over time, an increase in traits that increase an organism's chances to survive and reproduce will become more common in a population because that variation is heritable. Right? So the fittest, the most fit to the environment. Organisms with traits most well suited to their environment. Will become will survive, there we go, and have offspring making their traits more common in future generations, and eventually leading to sometimes overall changes in a species. But again, this takes a lot of time. So over many generations, this example up top, we may see that no more of that tan gene is around. It hasn't survived because all of the mice that have that tan gene get eaten by birds. But that trait could still be somewhere, recessive in one of these other gray mice's DNA, and they could still continue to have tan mice in the population, but once over time, that gene has now been completely rooted out. It is no longer present in the environment. We might say that the gray mice have actually evolved into a different species entirely of mice. And this can happen when populations get separated by certain ecological barriers or geographic barriers, like if a river all of a sudden changes course and separates two different populations of mice on either side of the river. At first, they're still going to be the same species, but then over time, with that geographic isolation, they might become two different species of mice. So, okay, now we're going to do some pair practice. Looking at these examples, and it's just 2 examples, we're going to identify the 5 points in Darwin's scenario. So let's go ahead and do the first one. We'll do the first one together and then you'll pause the video and do the second one on your own. So there are 2 types of worms: worms that eat at night, nocturnal, and worms that eat during the day, diurnal. The birds that eat during the day seem to be eating only the diurnal worms. The nocturnal worms are in their burrows during this time. Each spring, when the worms reproduce, they have about 500 babies, but only 100 of these 500 ever become old enough to reproduce. What worm has natural selection selected against? So we can see here, natural selection is selecting against the diurnal worms. Why? Well, the diurnal worms are the ones that are getting eaten by the birds, right? Because they're the ones that are out during the day. The diurnal worms that go out to eat during the day keep getting eaten by birds. So natural selection is selecting for the nocturnal worms, meaning that they have traits more fit to their environment. In this case, their eating schedule. So now we need to identify the 5 points of natural selection in this scenario. So we can see here the population has variation. Yes, we just said there are nocturnal worms and diurnal worms. Some variations are favorable. In this case, being nocturnal is favorable, right? Being nocturnal means you're not going to get eaten by predators. Are more offspring produced than survive? Yes, 500 babies are produced, but only 100 ever become old enough to reproduce. Yes. Those that survive have favorable traits. We know that it is going to be the nocturnal worms that are surviving. To pass along their traits. And will the population change over time? Based upon this scenario, we can say, yes, it will. There will be more nocturnal worms in the future. Until maybe the entire species of worms becomes nocturnal. And then that might be an evolution of one species that had this variety, diurnal and nocturnal worms, to become a different species that is genetically different of only nocturnal worms. But that wouldn't just happen right away, that happens over time. But we can see the forces of natural selection playing out. So all right, now let's read this last one. There are 3 types of polar bears, ones with thick coats, ones with medium coats, and ones with thin coats. It is fall and soon to be winter. The temperatures are dropping rapidly and the bears must be kept warm or they will freeze to death. Many of the bears had approximately 2 cubs each, but due to the extreme temperatures, many mothers only have 1 cub left. So the temperatures are dropping rapidly and they must be kept warm or they will freeze to death. So what bear will natural selection select against? We can see here we have 3 varieties: thick coats, medium coats, and thin coats. Based on it being so cold, natural selection is selecting against medium or thin coats. And for the thick coats, right? So they'll stay warm. Now go ahead and pause this video and fill out the 5 points and then come back to check your answers. All right, I hope you paused the video. All right, so the 5 points identified from the scenario above, we said that the population has 3 types of bears, ones with thick coats, ones with medium coats, and ones with thin coats. So those are the variations in the population. Some variations are favorable. We said natural selection is selecting for these thick coats because the temperatures are so cold where these bears live. Are more offspring produced than can survive? Yes. The text up here says that many of the bears had 2 cubs each, but due to the extreme temperatures, many mothers only have 1 cub left. So the cold is killing these little polar bear cubs. So what does that tell us about who is going to survive? It's the cold that's killing them. So the ones that survive will have medium or thick coats. And then over time, because those variations are heritable, the population will have more medium and thick coats. And eventually, over time, the entire population of polar bears could have thicker coats because that would make them more fit to their environment. So, all right, that was our first day of Unit 8, Evolution. Please go ahead and complete your exit ticket. Today's aim was, how does natural selection lead to evolution of a new species? And I hope you enjoyed that. Have a super fantastic day, and I'll see you guys all tomorrow on Zoom. Bye, guys.